This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. For decades, there were cities and towns that were all white on purpose. These communities are known as sundown towns. At the peak of the exclusionary practice in 1970, an estimated 10,000 communities across the U.S. kept out African Americans by force, law, or custom. Many sundown suburbs also excluded Jewish and Chinese Americans and other minority groups. Because this practice was both formal and informal, researchers put together a database of these laws, customs, and first-hand accounts. There are 40 towns listed as possible past sundown towns here in Connecticut. Coming up, we'll hear how this practice extended into housing policy. But first, here to discuss this database and what it can tell us is Dr. Stephen Berrey. He's an assistant professor of American culture and history at the University of Michigan. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And for our listeners, do you have a memory of a sundown town where we live? You can contribute to the database or join the conversation. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So we'll be talking a lot this hour about the late James or Jim Logan. He was a sociologist and the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me. The New York Times described him in his obituary in 2021 as a civil rights champion who took high school teachers and textbook publishers to task for distorting American history. So, Stephen, I want to start this conversation first by asking, when did Jim begin to document sundown towns?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in part because it is a relatively unknown practice, especially including among historians. And Jim, after he published Lies My Teacher Told Me, which is a best-selling book, was thinking about his experiences growing up in central Illinois. And he knew that there were some towns around where he grew up in Decatur, Illinois, that had excluded some groups, and especially in this case, Black people from living in their towns. And it was that curiosity that led him to start looking in Illinois. And as he continued to look, he realized, there are also these towns in Indiana and Wisconsin, and was just essentially expanding out beyond that. And this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. The more he looked, the more he saw that these towns were all over the country, especially in the Midwest, the West, and the Northeast.
And so I think it hits different always when this is something that I feel like I've always known was a thing, but when you put a label on it, it feels a little different. And you've also taken over this really enormous database and public project. So how do you go about proving or disproving a sundown town?
Yeah, I think that's right. Like it does mean something different when we give something a label, when we can have a category for it. And for example, if I talk about segregation, people know what that means. They know that that's connected to some laws, to some particular customs, that it's connected to things like separate water fountains. And there is something important and powerful in being able to give a name to these practices. And in our case, in terms of the evidence, it's challenging in part because there are a lot of different ways in which a place became a sundown town or remained a sundown town. There are some cases similar to some of the segregation policies in which there were ordinances or laws passed in particular towns that said, officially, we're not going to allow particular groups to live in this town. But it was probably much more common for it not to come from an ordinance, but to come from other kinds of practices, informal practices, like policing issues in which police would follow somebody around or even pick them up and escort them to the railroad station to send them out of town, or even from individuals in the town to be able to say to somebody, you're not welcome in this town, or even in cases where they may even think they're being helpful to say, just so you know, you shouldn't be in this town. It's not safe for you. That ultimately ends up reinforcing a place as a sundown town, a place that you have to be out of town by sundown. In other words, you can't live in this place. And in terms of our evidence, we usually our evidence often comes from people going to our website and submitting information to us saying, why don't you have this town on the list? I think you should include this town. And we'll do research that usually begins with census data, in which we'll look census by census, who's living in this town, looking at the racial categories. And that alone isn't enough to tell us if a place is a sundown town. For example, if we see 0 Black people living in a particular town, it means that it's possibly a sundown town, but it also means that then we want to do more research. We want to find out why that's the case. Or what we'll also look for when we're looking at census data is, okay, if there is a decade in which a population drops dramatically, that's an indication that something might have happened during that decade. For example, in Greensburg, Indiana, we know in the 1907 that there was mob violence that drove out much of the Black population, and you see that reflected in the census data. But if you just started with the census data, it would tell you something happened in that decade. And so once we get the census data, we go to all kinds of other sources, written sources, newspaper accounts, other local history documents from the period. And then most often, because it's where we often practice that people don't talk about or document, we rely on oral history, and we'll go to people in that town, talk to them about their memories of growing up in a place, find out more information from stories handed down. We'll also go to nearby towns, because often it's a nearby town where people in that town know that, oh yeah, we know that you should stay away from this town, or when we were growing up, you should stay away from this town. But we know that in those oral histories, people have lots of stories about their own experiences, firsthand accounts. And so ultimately, we put those things together, the census data, the primary sources from the period, and the oral histories to then make an assessment about whether or not a place was a sundown town.
So I definitely want to talk more details about basically everything you just mentioned. But I guess adding to sort of the oral history or the anecdotes is when I first moved here, late 2018, a friend and colleague had mentioned that there are certain communities here in Connecticut that did not really allow people of color to buy houses or even look at houses in certain communities. And so I wasn't super shocked to learn that the sundown town practice peaked in the 1970s, but it still hit a certain place in my brain that's not very far away in terms of history from us today. And in some places, it lasted even through the 90s. So can you talk about, when did this practice begin based on your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the right question because it is a historically specific practice, that it's not just, oh, there always have been people who have engaged in certain practices, but we can connect it to a particular period. And perhaps not surprisingly, it's in the late 19th century that we see this practice emerging, the same moment in which we get the exclusion of Chinese people into the country, the same period in which Jim Crow practices are emerging, especially in the South, around segregation and new laws. And, those things are happening in part because it is this post-emancipation period after the Civil War. And so in the 1870s, 1880s, increasingly Black people are migrating around the country, making all sorts of gains during the Reconstruction period. And some of those people are migrating out of the South into small towns. And one of the responses to that, whether it's Black populations or Chinese populations, one of the responses was to either drive out or keep out some of these groups. And to take the example in the West in this period, there were Chinese populations, Chinatowns in small towns across the West in the late 19th century. And most of those populations were driven out and ended up in cities where it was relatively safe for people in larger numbers. So it starts in the 1870s, 1880s. It peaks in the 1970s, connected in part to the Civil Rights Movement, to the Fair Housing Act, and various practices in place that make it harder to carry out these practices. But we do know that it continues past the 1970s and continues into our present in some places.
So we know that towns are listed based on the strength of evidence collected, especially with what you just mentioned too, a mix of census data, oral history, and whatnots. And so For example, here in Connecticut, there are 40 reported sundown towns, 10 of which are listed as probable. Can you touch on the range of source material you have in order to make that list?
Yeah, it a lot of it does begin with census data, and but in taking the examples from Connecticut, we draw on a number of sources. One of the fascinating documents that I think sheds light on how things are play out in Connecticut in this period is a 1961 survey commissioned by the Connecticut Commission on Civil Rights. And they surveyed white populations and Black populations on their attitudes toward racial integration. They asked them questions whether or not were in favor of integrated public schools, integrated employment, churches, private schools, public housing, private residential neighborhoods, like a whole long list of things. And the options were in favor, acceptable, oppose, or don't know. And the numbers from the survey for white attitudes toward integration in Connecticut in 1961 overwhelmingly were not in favor I'm sorry, were in favor of public schools by 95% in favor or acceptable to have integrated public schools. But when you get down to neighborhoods, that number drops to 57% in favor or acceptable to those neighborhoods. And it's a reminder of like the ways in which housing issues play out. So we start with information like that, and then we dig into newspapers, census data, books that people have written about particular communities in Connecticut, and oral histories.
And so, with a mix of that source material, you start with firsthand or even secondhand accounts along with data. Do you know how many sundown towns you've documented in total? And what's your sense of how comprehensive that number is? And do you continue to sort of field emails or talk to people and continue to gather that data?
Yeah, absolutely. We've documented, I don't have the exact number, but we've documented hundreds of towns around the country. I know that Jim and his research had the sense that there were probably 10,000 of these towns. And so that tells you how many we don't have in the database that should probably be listed. And we get emails every day, people going to the website, lots of emails saying, why don't you have this town listed? Here's my experience, or here's what I know about this place. And, I will get, I would say our database will get maybe 100 emails a week on a normal week. And then if something is in the news about sundown towns, we may get 1,000 emails that week. And it's a reminder that people, kind of as you said earlier, that like people kind of know about this. And when you put a name on it, they have all kinds of stories about related experiences.
Right. And it's amazing to hear. That seems like a lot of engagement, I feel like, with something like this, and to hear that people still have stories to share. I think it's both, great and not great at the same time. But are there any trends you observed in Connecticut specifically?
Yeah, one of the things that we noticed, especially in Connecticut, so far, I like thinking nationally, I've talked a fair amount about the exclusion of Black people, and we do see some of that in some of the Connecticut towns, but also especially prominent in Connecticut is the exclusion of Jewish populations, particularly in the 20th century, and especially in suburbs, and that seems to be more pronounced in Connecticut than it is in other states.
And there was mentioned an influence from the gentleman's agreement. Can we talk more about that reference for those who may not know what it means?
Sure. The Gentleman's Agreement was a novel published in the mid 1940s, I think 1947, that then became a film. And it focused on Darien, Connecticut as a place that excluded Jewish populations. And it's one of those, I think, cultural moments that brought a lot of attention to this practice that in some ways, I think, as we were talking earlier, it gave a name for something that was happening, and it shed light on that. It is a novel, so it is this fictional account, but it was also based on experiences that that show up in these places and that drew attention to it after that.
It seems really interesting that that's very sort of specific to Connecticut. Have you seen other trends of religious exclusion that's unique to the state?
Yeah, we have a couple of hints of evidence of potentially Roman Catholic populations being excluded. There was a possible reference to that in Portland, Connecticut. Not 100% conclusive. And again, it is one of the challenges of this work is that we get lots of evidence in and lots of references, and it is putting those pieces together to try to figure out how much can we say conclusively or confidently. But there are some hints of not only of Jewish populations, but also of Catholic populations being excluded in some places.
You've been listening to Dr. Stephen Berrey at the University of Michigan. He oversees a massive database of sundown towns in the U.S., which is linked on our website at ctpublic.org/where we live. Glastonbury, Darien, and Madison are all listed as probable past sundown towns. You can contribute to this database or join the conversation after a quick break. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're discussing the history of sundown towns in Connecticut and across the U.S. These were communities where, either through force, law, or custom, Black Americans and sometimes other racial and religious groups were excluded after dark. Joining us now to discuss some of her reporting on the subject is Logan Jaffe. She's a ProPublica reporter. Thank you so much, Logan, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me, Kat.
And still with us is Dr. Stephen Berrey. He's an assistant professor of American culture and history at the University of Michigan. And a quick reminder for our listeners that this is a practice that peaked in the 1970s. Do you have a memory of a sundown town in Connecticut? Let us know, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Logan, you've covered sundown towns in Illinois where this research project basically began. And there's one town in particular that you focus. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So the town is called Anna, Illinois, and it is located in southern Illinois. I'd say about 35 miles from the state's southern border. It sits between two towns that are a bit more populated. Anna has about 4,000 people in it. And according to the 2010 census, about 95.7% of its population are white.
And as ProPublica often does, you publish partner pieces working to engage the public on this particular issue. And one story from you was headlined, "It's time for sundown towns to become a more visible part of Illinois history. But how?" So what did you learn from that process, inviting readers to discuss their community's history of racial exclusion?
Yeah, and this is something that, Dr. Lowen was really adamant about as he was doing his own research into sundown towns. Like Dr. Berrey mentioned, Dr. Lowen was from Decatur, Illinois, so not too far away from Anna. And I should mention that Dr. Lowen wrote about Anna in his own book, Sundown Towns, which is how I ended up in Anna, because I was following up on this. Right. The aspect of community engagement was key to Dr. Lowen's work, so I wanted to be sure to also mirror that in the work that I did. And, what really surprised me is how willing so many people were to really talk about difficult history. At first when I was reporting in Anna, I was nervous myself. I'm white and I'm in a mostly white place. So, I guess on paper, I should feel maybe less nervous than a person of color might. And I would go around town, I'd hang out outside of the Walmart. I would go to community events. I'd go to town meetings, and I would kind of ask people, have you heard about this legend surrounding the town name. I should have said this earlier, but the legend
No.
of Anna is that the town stands for ain't no N words allowed. And this lore is very pervasive. But the more I would ask people, the harder it was for me to find somebody who had not heard it. And this was, in 2019, 2018, as I was doing this.
Wow. And did that, what else surprised you in this process? We were just talking about earlier too. I feel like a lot of people are, aware that this exists, but when you put a label on it, it becomes a different thing. So was there anything else that surprised you about the process? And especially this was published just before 2020, so it's not very long ago.
Right. It's not very long ago. And, what interested me and what very much surprised me about Anna and just to kind of see these dynamics in practice is how a community, Anna's a pretty small town. It's pretty tight knit. There are a lot of people who live there whose ancestors were some of the founding members of this community, right? So there is a lore in Anna of it being a sundown town, whether or not many people who lived there knew that exact phrase or not. But there was this sort of I guess cognitive dissonance I noticed of people really being proud of their history, but also feeling very sure that their community had moved past the sort of in-your-face levels of racism that being a sundown town in the past and these more violent methods of exclusion and expulsion of Black people in Anna went about. So there was an interest and a pride in local history, but there was also a sort of underlying current of, we don't talk about that. We're past that part of our history. Anna isn't like that anymore. So one of the main questions I was trying to answer was, I would ask people, well, what do you mean? What was it like? How do you know it's different now than it was then? And that's sort of where my reporting took me.
And how were the reactions, or how has the reactions been when you asked that question?
It was varied, at the beginning when I started reporting, one of the things I did is I went to the local library. I looked in their local history section. There was hardly anything about, the history, any sort of history of race in the community, because it's sort of a default lens that this community is almost entirely white, and we don't need to talk about race because, as one person, I'll never forget, one person said, we don't have a racial problem because there's no Black people here. Which is I think that tells you a lot of what you need to know. But, right. Since this story came out, there have been signs of change in Anna. In the summer of 2020, a group of young organizers from surrounding towns decided to protest against police brutality and in support of Black lives. And this was the first Black Lives Matter protest that ever happened in Anna. And it was a defining moment, I think, in that town, especially for younger people and younger people of color in surrounding communities who can have something visible to point to that we don't want Anna to stand for this anymore, and we want it to change.
Right. And Stephen, I want to bring you to this conversation too, is with what Logan just shared, how does this kind of reporting forward your own research?
Yeah, absolutely. I think exactly what Logan is saying is that we want people to come to our research and not only to think, okay, this is something historical and we'll leave it in the past, but we want people to come to it and think not only like, it is important to know this past. It's important to tell the truth about the past and to understand that these are things that have happened. But we also want people from that point to pivot forward and say, so what kind of community do we want to be? If this is what the past is, how do we respond to that? And that's what I hear a lot. And in Logan's reporting, like one of the things I think is so fascinating about the story is following like how people's interactions are in this town, and especially as you hear people talking about this history and thinking about what it means for the present and future.
And a quick reminder to our listeners that you can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Now on the line with us is Paul Saubestre. He's a volunteer researcher with the Hamden Historical Society. Thanks, Paul, for joining us today.
Yes, happy to be here.
So, Paul, you've been on the program before to talk about a very specific line that you found in the deed of your parents' house. Can you tell us about your discovery?
Yes, I'll read the specific clause I verbatim here. It says, "No persons of any race other than the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent the occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant." So I think what's interesting is that it prohibited not only anyone other than white people from buying or renting a house, but even for being a guest of someone in the house there. So I think that really pointed out to, in a sense, being a sundown neighborhood.
Right, and
not white could be there.
Right, and Paul, this isn't something that the Historical Society has set out to document, but have you come across any other deeds with similar stipulations?
I know that other houses in the neighborhood have had the same restriction. I mean, this paragraph was in all the probably 100 or so houses in this specific development, and I suspect elsewhere too. If there were those redlining maps made, and to get that highest A grade on the redlining map, they had to have that restriction in place, and there were many, several other neighborhoods in Hamden had that A grade, so I'm sure it was pervasive.
And Paul, with that experience too, and with you finding that line in the deed to your own parents' home, what was going through your mind when you first came across it? Do you remember?
Yeah, it's just how it persists today in the neighborhood. This is a neighborhood called Spring Glen that to this date has the lowest percentage of non-white people as of the 2020 census. The one census tract in Spring Glen had only a 19% non-white population. And you can contrast that to another neighborhood in Hamden, Highwood, had 86%. So it's not that Hamden is overall not integrated, but the effects of these racial covenants put in place 50 years ago still persist today.
And Paul, Hamden is currently not on the list of the 40 towns on the Sundown Town database. Do you have any plans to look into this more?
Yeah, I would suspect that because overall, if you're considering the town overall, there were quite a few black people, and back into the early 20th century, there were one neighborhood near New Haven had always had a significant black population. So perhaps if they're not going to the neighborhood level, Hamden would not be and would not qualify as a sundown town. Indeed, I think around this year, if the recent demographic trends continue, around this year, Hamden would be a majority non-white or either non-white or Hispanic Latino population in Hamden now.
Well, Paul Saubestre, thank you so much for your time and for taking the time and calling us today. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
And Stephen, you've been listening to what Paul was saying. Is this the type of experience that you would see or hear from the people that you speak with?
Yes, definitely. And I just wanted to add, I'm really glad that Paul brought this up, that what he's describing is a restrictive covenant. And those restrictive covenants were really common across the country. They were deemed unconstitutional in the 1948 Shelley v. Kramer decision. But they are still very much in those contracts. And I suspect that a lot of people listening, if you live in a house that was built in, before the 1940s, there's a really good chance that that's also, you'll see some of that language in your housing contract. And it was a really common practice. And the other thing I would add to that is that even after 1948, we know that even though this was unconstitutional, that informally this practice continued in which people were excluded from particular neighborhoods, and that real estate agents in particular could play a really important role in maintaining exclusivity by sending people to other neighborhoods, not showing them particular houses. And so even getting rid of a formal practice still left open lots of informal practices.
And we have another caller on the air, Christy from Marlborough. You're on.
Hi.
Hi, go for it.
Okay, so my name is Christy Wrench Moraga, and I grew up in Glastonbury. I live in Marlborough now. And I remember at the end of the 1960s or the beginning of the 1970s that there was a black family that wanted to come to town because the father was a math teacher, and the real estate agent would not take them around. So my mother, who was a pediatrician in town, did take them around and helped the family find a home. And my mother also had the idea that she did not want her children to grow up selfish in Glastonbury. So she convinced my father, who was also a doctor, and they took the 5 children and we went to Chad, Africa for a year in the Peace Corps. But at that time, since my father was the director, my mother was not allowed to be in the Peace Corps. So she went to the hospital, the pediatric hospital, every day, just to volunteer.
Well, Christy, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and for taking the time and calling us. Stephen, what's your response in terms of Glastonbury was a probable sundown town according to the database?
Yeah, I appreciate hearing that story. It's not evidence that we have in our database. We have evidence of other people sharing similar kinds of stories. And so I hope that caller will reach out to us because we're heavily dependent on volunteers and people who know things to share information with us that we can then follow up on. And I will say that the other things that we have on Glastonbury in the same period is evidence of a local group who was organizing to try to keep Black populations out in the 1960s, 1970s. And we also do have some of those stories of Black people being threatened when they were trying to buy a home there.
And we also have another question. Katie from Bloomfield had called in earlier to ask if hospitals or healthcare has been studied in sundown towns. This is something that comes up in her nursing practice. Stephen, is this something that you can respond to?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think the question, at least as I understand the question, is like what are the implications of sundown towns? Like, do we see like results of that showing up in other arenas in terms of things like, does that impact healthcare? And the short answer is that we haven't studied specifically hospitals, but we know that lots of sundown towns or former sundown towns have what Jim would refer to as second generation sundown town issues, that a place that was a sundown town, we often see in subsequent generations a legacy of discriminatory practices, of racial disparities, including in things like healthcare, policing issues, and all sorts of other issues around race relations in these places. And I think that's what that question is getting at. And I suspect that if we did a study like that, we would see a legacy in those places.
And yeah, I have something real quick to add to that because it's such an interesting question. And thank you, for this question, Katie. So in Anna, there was another dimension of healthcare and its status as a sundown town, which is Anna is home or was home to a state hospital, a state mental health facility in Illinois. It was run by the state. And one thing that I came across in my research is that, the population of residents and patients at this healthcare facility it was more likely for those people to be people who were not white because of this state institution. And those were part of the town, counted in some ways as part of the town population. And so that's another aspect of this. If there are, residential healthcare facilities if they're run by a state agency or even then, that could contribute to a little bit, like a bit of a specific population.
You've been listening to ProPublica reporter Logan Jaffe, and Dr. Stephen Berrey from University of Michigan will be sticking around. For our listeners, you can contribute to this database of sundown towns in Connecticut. Find more information on our website at ctpublic.org/where we live, or you can join the conversation 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're discussing the history of sundown towns where we live. And back with us to talk about it is Dr. Stephen Berrey. He's an assistant professor of American culture and history at the University of Michigan, and Logan Jaffe, who is a reporter with ProPublica. So we've discussed how this practice was often enforced under wraps. James Lowen tried hard to get a photo of a typical sundown town sign, but was unsuccessful. But let's listen to him talking about the important role local historical societies can play in documenting these histories.
Most sundown towns never even had a sign. In West Frankfort, I said to the librarian, who was also the head of the historical society, I said, do you have the sign or do you have a photo of it? And she replied, no, why would we keep that? Well, if you're the historical society, that is, of course, one of the more important aspects of the town's history. And here you have a memento of it. You have an actual sign or you have an actual photo of it. That's why you would keep that. But many, many historical societies in small towns and even in larger cities really only want to talk about the good things that happened in the town. And they don't want to dwell on the fact that the town was for decades, including when I was there 10 years ago, was a sundown town.
Logan, I want to ask, what are your thoughts about what Jim has to say here? You knew him very well from your research.
Yeah, it's so great to hear that clip. And I was, as I was listening to it, I was thinking about my experience going to the Union County History Museum, which is just north of Anna in another town called Hamden. And, I went there to learn more about the history of Anna, in Union County, Illinois. And I was also going there to learn about how that community told the story of itself in this, historical society / museum setting. And, I went through the historical society. There was a lot of mementos, just things that people had donated, old photographs, old, things from people's homes. When I asked the person who runs the historical society about whether he gets any questions about the legend of ANNA, he looked at me and he said, we get them from outsiders like you. And to me, that said everything. And he was willing to sit down and talk with me about it. And I learned a lot about, the history of Union County in the Civil War. And, but yeah, it rings very true to what Dr. Lowen was expressing in that tape, is that, a local community is often interested, I should say, in telling a celebratory history of itself. I think that that's beginning to change. And I think that, there's plenty of evidence of towns really confronting their history. And I'm encouraged to see that sort of work happening in different places.
And Stephen, especially with what Logan just shared and the clip we just heard from James Lowen, can you touch on why it was so unique in the way he framed history? Because he really wasn't afraid to qualify something as racist or even something as BS.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Logan that it's always nice to hear clips of Jim's voice. He was so passionate about this research. And I think like part of what Jim is referencing there is like he's talking about troubling pasts. And we know that like that's or what some historians refer to as hard history. And we know that those things are challenging to grapple with. That, as Jim was saying, like people want to focus on like these, they want to celebrate particular things about their past, and which is understandable. And at the same time, like getting at these paths, that being able to tell the truth about the past, being able to get the history right is really important for who we are in the present, that these things don't just go away, that there are legacies of these things in the present, and that they will persist until we grapple with them. And one of the things we really push places to do is both to document this past, but also to think about, well, so what do we do with this hard history now that we know it?
And we also have another caller, Aram for New Britain. You're on the air, Aram.
Yes. Hello, Catherine. Long time no see.
Nice to hear from you.
Yes. I want to first acknowledge Dr. Lowen because we invited him. I'm a retired professor at Central Connecticut State University, and we invited him at least twice to Connecticut to speak about sundown towns. But I wanted to bring up the point, of course, about zoning, that the zoning regulations in many towns and cities in Connecticut are still exclusionary, and despite a legislation, they still allow locals to exclude multifamily housing and so on. So Berrey, among others, is still mostly white and mostly Christians, so not much have changed in Connecticut.
Well, thank you so much, Aram, for calling in and letting us know your thoughts. Steve, I want to ask your response in terms of policy. I know we wanted to get a little bit about housing earlier, so can you talk about whether or not what Aram said is surprising to you or no?
It's not surprising. I'm actually glad he mentioned that, because it's something we haven't talked about much, is like the zoning practices are another way in which places can be exclusionary. And this is especially a common practice post-World War II as suburbs are emerging across the country, that those zoning practices are connected to the emergence of suburbs, to places like, for example, the various Levitt towns. And those early Levitt towns had those restrictive covenants that said you couldn't sell to particular groups of people, but also alongside of that, zoning practices that would similarly maintain an exclusive place. And it's especially common in these post-World War II suburbs.
And Stephen, looking forward, what can sundown towns do to address this history and its effects? What do those conversations look like?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. We like to work with communities as much as we're interested in documenting this past. We're also invested in thinking about, so now what do you do? How do you respond to this history? And Jim used to talk about this in a 3-step process of getting places first to acknowledge the past, to say, this is what we did, and then an official apology for that past. But then the third step, and I think the most challenging one, is like, so looking to the future, how do you work to become a place that isn't exclusionary, that is a welcoming place where anyone will feel welcome to live there? And often that means thinking about things like investments in, like financial investments, in terms of hiring initiatives, in terms of things like zoning practices. And we've worked with a few communities, especially recently. There are communities who have walked through those 3 steps and started to think about, well, what does the future look like? And that's really what ultimately we want people to do, is to think about, what does the future look like in their town?
And so Jim has been quoted saying that there's a big difference between not wanting to be a sundown town and not wanting to be seen as a sundown town. We want to end with one more quip from James Lowen.
I want to make this comment. Nobody is just a racist. And let me give you an example. Calhoun County, Illinois, not too far from Anna. It's in central Illinois. It's just north of St. Louis, Missouri, actually. The whole county, the last time I was there, was a sundown county. Not one black family lived in that county. Well, there was one interracial couple. I was there about when President Obama took office. And that county had voted for Obama. by 52% to 47%. Now, that's an all-white county. You got to remember, white people in America did not vote for Obama. They voted for McCain. The only reason Obama won was because Black people voted for Obama overwhelmingly, and Latino and Asian American people voted for Obama substantially. So that was an unracist act to vote for Obama. Now, that's a contradiction. And so the same person can be racist given one frame of rhetoric or in one situation and unracist in another. And we have to realize that and appeal to their unracist side.
So we only have a couple minutes left here, but Stephen, I want to ask, what's your response and final thoughts to what Jim had to say there?
Yeah, I will say really quickly that it's a reminder that this, regardless of the politics of a place, like this practice transcends it in the same way that like segregation practices transcend politics. And I will make one final plug to people who have information that I hope they'll go to our website and share that information with us. We're always looking for volunteers to help us do this research.
And we will have the information as well at ctpublic.org/where we live. Logan, we got about a minute left here, but would love to ask, what are your final thoughts with everything that we talked about today?
My final thoughts are, in the past couple years, with the Sundown Town Lab at the University of Michigan and the work that Dr. Berrey is doing, there's been so much attention and sort of a resurgence about researching sundown towns and people understanding what that term means. And I'd encourage people who know something about their community to interview people in your community to talk about it. If anything, from my experience, people are interested and willing to discuss difficult history if you come from a place of genuine curiosity and understanding. And I'd encourage people to check out the Sundown Towns database and to collect stories and do research.
ProPublica reporter Logan Jaffe, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And also Dr. Stephen Berrey from the University of Michigan, thank you so much for having this conversation with us today.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
And also a quick shout out for our listeners. Thank you all for calling and making this a much richer conversation. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.